Hello, this is David Rovix hosting another live stream broadcast, which is appearing on the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance, Cebu Community Radio, and various other platforms. During the pandemic, since I can no longer tour and play music for a living, I've taken to broadcasting most every weekday at 10 a.m. Pacific, noon Central, 1 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. GMT. On Mondays, it's an open mic, which I call Pandemic Open Mic Mondays, which folks are encouraged to sign up to participate in at davidrovix.com/POMM. Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays, I've been interviewing my friends for the most part and sort of publicly catching up with people who I might otherwise be hanging out with physically on a typical tour, if such things were still happening. On Tuesdays, however, the broadcast has an actual producer, longtime Detroit area talk show host and Fifth Estate magazine editorial collective member, Peter Werby. These days, Fifth Estate is a quarterly print magazine that has been published in one form or another since its founding in 1965. You can read the entirety of the spring issue online at fifthestate.org. You can also subscribe to the print magazine there and hear previous episodes of Fifth Estate Live as well. Today's guest, Eric Laursen, is a longtime anarchist writer, organizer, and independent journalist who is a regular contributor to the Fifth Estate magazine. He's one of the founders of the New York City Anarchist Book Fair and a member of Agency, the anarchist PR project that works to amplify anarchist perspectives through original commentary, syndicated content, and breaking news. He's also the author or co-author of 3 books: Understanding the Crash, about the economic crash of 2008, The People's Pension, the struggle to defend Social Security since Reagan, and The Duty to Stand Aside, 1984, and the wartime quarrel of George Orwell and Alex Comfort. Eric, welcome to the Fifth Estate Live. Great to have you,
David.
here.
Thanks for having me on.
Oh yeah, pleasure. We just realized we have a 2-second delay, but that's very normal, and it's good. So it's always where to start because there's way too much happening in the world today, but we are in the middle of multiple crises at the same time, and one of them is a health crisis. Another is economic. There's a bunch of others, but maybe we can start with the economic. And you wrote that also a fantastically illustrated book, a graphic novel sort of thing with Seth Tabachman, another fantastic artist from New York, after the crash. But Understanding the Crash, but we're just take a few minutes to sort of lay out your understanding of the current political moment, would you, in terms of the economy, the bailout, the coming depression, anything along those lines?
Yeah, the coming depression or the present depression, depending on how you want to look at it, or the flash depression would be another way to think about it.
What's flash depression?
What do you mean in other words, we've had an economic turndown that is related very, very powerfully to a global health crisis that emerged very suddenly. And the assumption has been by a lot of people for some months, I think this is beginning to change now, that the health crisis will end and the economy will then pop back up to where it was before. In other words, the whole thing will be a kind of an aberration. What we're seeing now is that it's not an aberration. Pandemics don't take a kind of a V shape, which is what the economists were talking about for weeks and weeks and weeks. They take more of a W pattern that goes on and on and on over a period of at least a couple of years. And that's looking now like what we're going to see here. The people who get trampled underfoot in the midst of all this are not just poor people and communities of color, which have been hit tremendously hard by the pandemic. The infection and the death rates have been way higher, which should be no surprise given the fact that we know that communities of color in this country often are situated in areas like the Louisiana sort of death coast, which are unhealthy anyway, and are forced to live in conditions that are not conducive to good public health. But actually, it extends a lot further this time because of the precarity of working people in general in this country and elsewhere. There are people who are being sucked under who a couple of years ago never would have thought this could happen to them. They never thought they would be laid off. They never thought they would be out of gigs somehow to do. All of a sudden, their supports are being cut out from under them. One similarity to the crash that happened in 2008 is that the federal government, the Federal Reserve, the powers that be, jumped very, very fast to deal with the crisis. But what they mostly did was bail out the rich, those like themselves. The actual money, if you look at what the Federal Reserve put in cheap loans, the spending that Congress approved for businesses of one sort or another, supposedly small businesses, but as we know, it actually went to a lot of businesses that don't really fall into that category. It's something like a 10-to-1 imbalance. Business capital and so forth got about 10 times as much money as actually went to poorer working people. Those people got $600 checks, which was very helpful actually, and has probably done more to support the economy or to support the actual consumer economy than anything that's gone to businesses up to now. And Congress is now literally talking about ending that.
And incidentally, they're talking about ending it, and also they're on the corporate media. They're always talking about how many people are receiving this $600 and how it supposedly has gone to all the unemployed workers, and that is not the case. And I'm one of the 70,000 gig workers in Oregon alone. Out of the 400,000 unemployed people in Oregon, that last I checked, 100,000 of them are gig workers. 30,000 of us have gotten responses, including rejections. And 70,000 have heard nothing. And it's been 3 months. And the program's going to end. And I haven't seen a penny from the state of Oregon, along with lots of other people. It's
been a tremendously slow process. And there's other problems, too. I mean, Congress is now talking about replacing it to some extent with a payroll tax cut, which is bad policy for two reasons. Number one, it robs money from the trust fund that supports the Social Security system, so it undermines it in the long run. Number two, if you can believe it, that they're giving payroll tax by definition is taxes paid by people who are currently working, and so they're talking about giving money to people who still have jobs rather than people who've lost the jobs. It doesn't make sense as a method of stimulus. It does make sense if you want to undermine Social Security. So it gets back to that famous thing that Rahm Emanuel said years ago when he was the Clinton the Obama chief of staff, which is you never let a good crisis go to waste. And we have Republicans and centrist Democrats in Congress who are trying very, very hard to make sure they get something out of this.
This is classic crisis capitalism, where they take advantage of a crisis to further the aims of the corporate elite even more. While meanwhile, even loads of millionaires are now coming out and saying, "Hey, this situation is completely untenable. We're going to have a revolution if you don't do something about distributing the wealth a bit better." And yet, everything is going exactly in the other direction under both Democratic and Republican administrations for decades now.
Yeah. I mean, there are you can't ascribe a whole lot of genuine social concern to millionaires and billionaires, but a lot of them who have some common sense are very, very worried about the public image and the public impression that this gives, that they will be seen as predators, and that will not be good for them in the long run, and it'll enable people to get into power, into lawmaking positions who want to crack down on them. So they understand their self-interest perhaps better than a lot of the more right-wing members of their class do.
The response to the crisis, of course, has been radically different in different parts of the world. And I wonder, like, do you have any thoughts on how things have been handled in, say, Denmark, and some other countries, but Denmark is the one I hear the most about because I know a lot of Danes, and they have basically maintained the sort of, I don't know, maintain I don't know what would be called like a zombie economy or something. I've heard terms like that used to like just subsidize everything so that it all is still there when the pandemic is over. But that nothing like that is happening here.
No. There's one difference that's pointed out very often, and I think there is a lot of credibility to it, which is that there's a divide between countries that have a high degree of, I guess what you would say, social trust, as opposed to those that don't. Denmark is a country that has had they have their political controversies too, but there's a basic sort of trust in the system that allows them to have a program where people understand, well, yes, we're giving quote unquote free money to people, but we all benefit in the long run from that. And the more dramatic example, I think, is in a way is Italy, which was hit very, very hard by the pandemic initially. Then the government actually cracked down very hard in terms of social isolation and so forth. And people did what they were told. They understood this was important. They followed the rules. They isolated themselves. They wore masks. And the virus has decreased in terms of its impact on the population. In this country, they don't have a phenomenon where of a big chunk of the population is essentially rejecting it. So you have social trust. People may have their problems with the government. They may have their problems with collective solutions to whatever. But when it comes to something like this, they have a certain amount of trust. This country is very different. This country, social trust has, I think, been pretty well destroyed in a lot of ways. It is understandable. And literally, you have populations that have every reason to distrust what experts and the government are telling them. Low-income people of color, who are obeying the rules and who are doing what they can to mitigate the impact on their communities. And you have other groups that are relatively privileged, like right-wing militias and so forth, who are doing the opposite. So it does come back to trust and to a feeling of we are part of a community instead of we are in an every person for themselves situation. So I think that's part of the split.
The difference between what we call rights and what much of the world understand as social obligations. It's this obligation versus rights concept.
Exactly. Yeah.
Although in some, where was I reading that in some language the concept of obligation and right is sort of like confused with each other, like it's sort of the same thing, which is interesting, I think.
Yeah, which it makes a certain amount of sense that with rights come responsibilities, particularly when you're talking about social creatures like human beings. That if you, the classic thing being wearing masks, you wear a mask not so much to protect yourself as to not infect other people. And the implication being, if you don't wear a mask, you're essentially saying, I have no responsibility for you. I have no responsibility for the rest of you.
In Europe, the European Union negotiators, I guess mostly heads of state, have been meeting for the past 4 days and nights, and they finally hashed out an agreement, which was very contentious. And I guess the final thing is 850 billion euros, half of which approximately are grants, and the other half are loans. And you got any thoughts on this? It was very contentious between, particularly.
That deal is extremely important. The details of it are not all laid out yet, and I haven't had a chance to review the latest on it. There were two issues about that deal. Number one was whether the EU would actually issue bonds that were obligations for all members of the EU. In other words, if we're going to use this money to help countries that are struggling in the southern tier, Italy, Spain, Greece, and so forth, all of us, all the countries, including the Northern European countries, are going to be putting that money in and be obligated to it. That's something the EU members have resisted up to now. There's a feeling that we're going to impose certain standards on Greece, if Greece has a problem, they have to deal with it themselves. That was the attitude, and that was disastrous for countries like Greece. This time they're saying the obligation is going to be on all of us, but, and this is the second part of it, and the really contentious part, is that some of the Northern European countries, such as the Netherlands, wanted to impose draconian conditions on those Southern European countries in order to get to actually use that money. In other words, you've got to balance your budget. You have to go for fiscal austerity, all the things that are sort of the classic neoliberal prescriptions. And that means that they're essentially going to treat those countries as economic colonies, as economic dependencies, just the way the IMF and the World Bank do with countries in the developing world. If the deal moves in that direction, then it is a very bad deal for those Southern European countries. And the advantage of actually having everyone put this money in is really kind of mitigated. It's not as advantageous a thing as it would be otherwise. So I'm still waiting to see to see the fine print on that deal. It could be a historic one. It could be it could be a real bust.
I wonder, I know there's clearly a lot of whole variety of reasons why some countries in Europe are far better off than others, but to what degree do you think the Danish and Finnish and Austrian negotiators who are constantly talking about corruption in Spain and Italy and other Southern European countries in particular, and I guess Eastern European countries now, they're all talking about Hungary a lot, but how much of the problem is actually corruption in governments like Italy and Spain now or historically, in terms of their economic disadvantaged situation compared to the North?
Well, corruption is a problem. I mean, Greece is actually a very good example, because you've got an oligarchy of wealthy families, a lot of them in the shipping business, that have basically controlled the economy there for many, many years. And a lot of the rules are in Greece are essentially set to basically work for the advantage of those big companies. So there is a problem there. The other side of that is that Greece is a different kind of it's a different kind of economy than a lot of people think it is. There's a lot of small business. Yes, people do retire early and get generous pensions, but they generally use those to start businesses. It's a very entrepreneurial place, which is not what we're taught to think about it. Greece has a healthier economy, but it's structured differently. They tend to have higher national debt, but that doesn't mean that the economy doesn't work. There is a corruption problem. There's a corruption problem in Italy. There's a corruption problem in Spain, which has been really bad the last few years. But the solution to to those problems is not to starve them of funds at a time when when economies are collapsing. It's the prescriptions that they've made for these countries, and when they do give them money, are generally structures so that they bail out the big banks, they bail out the big companies in those countries, which means in Greece, the oligarchs get bailed out, and everybody else has to pay for it. So in that sense, the kind of austerity they keep pushing on these countries doesn't even address the corruption problem. It doesn't address the roots of it, which is these economies that are top-heavy with very large, very privileged economic players.
I mean, the way you're describing it, I would say it actually sounds like they are encouraging the corruption by imposing these, which is a totally bizarre contradiction, which I never even thought about. But that's staggering. They're actually supporting these massive corporations that have been instrumental in creating the corrupt atmosphere in the first place.
Exactly. And that when a crisis like this comes along, or the crisis in 2008, it's always, well, these companies are too big to fail. We can't let them fail, because everything will go collapsing around our ears if they do, which is debatable. But that's the prime imperative. I mean, it's true in this country as well, is that the banking system was backed up immediately as soon as a problem started to develop over the coronavirus and the impact on the economy. Those banks are going to be, the bigger ones are going to be even bigger, as they were after 2008. So the problem effectively it snowballs after a situation like this.
So you're listening to Fifth Estate Live, which comes to you every Tuesday on various platforms, including the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance and KBOO Community Radio. You can find all the episodes archived in audio form at fifthestate.org, where you can also subscribe to the Fifth Estate print magazine. We're talking with author and organizer and regular Fifth Estate contributor, Eric Laursen. We're looking at, like, I find it really fascinating and entertaining to read the business press. Like Noam Chomsky said many times over many decades, that if you want to understand what's really happening in a country, you're much better off reading the business press than the main part of the newspaper, or whatever we call it these days, which I completely agree with. And you're hearing headlines like, the business press, first of all, they're having to come up with all kinds of new adjectives that I've never encountered in marketplace before, like in the NPR program, to describe how bad everything is. Yeah. So that's the search for new adjectives that adequately describe how bad things are is also is a good source of entertainment. But the situation is absolutely dire, and as they are all saying in recent weeks, every day a new article, a major press article, like they're really trying to get the attention of the politicians or something. They keep on saying we are looking at 20 to 28 million evictions by September. Right. And this is not the scale of it is different, but it's also like, it just seems like such a repeat of 2008 in terms of evictions and foreclosures as a result of the crash then, and then the way that the banks and investment companies went about trying to sort of take advantage of the situation, which is something that so many of us have been, very much living through, for the past 12 years. In my particular case, and I'm very typical, I think, in many cities, my rent has gone up by 250%.
Oh my God.
Since then. I moved to Portland in 2007. So I'm like, sort of the canary in the coal mine here.
Yeah, that brings up one of the adjectives I've been hearing a lot, which is eye-watering. Those are amazing numbers, David.
Eye-watering, yeah. What do you say about a 250% increase to eye-watering? That would be definitely a very good term, because it causes a lot of tears. That's for sure. Yeah.
Something a little more brutal, I think. But the figures about evictions are that points up again the difference between the solution, so-called, in this country and what's happening elsewhere. I mean, in Germany, for example, they have a program essentially in place when an economic crisis like this happens, where people are retained on the job for fewer hours. They do not let people go. They do not fire people. People are kept on so that essentially and it makes sense from an economic point of view, and that the human resources that are gathered together by an industrial operation stay together. You don't have to rebuild them afterwards. And it makes sense that there's an attempt to maintain a certain kind of stability. In this country at this time, that is absolutely not the case. If it was the case, that people wouldn't be talking in Congress about ending the $600 payments, because they would realize that this is what's keeping people, in some cases, from becoming homeless. That's simply not considered in this climate. One of the things that makes me optimistic is that we do have a very live tenants' rights movement that's grown up over the last few years in a lot of American cities, particularly New York, and that those people are mobilized. They are working ahead of time to stem evictions or to get action taken on these things. I don't know to what extent they're going to succeed, but at the very least, that's one segment of the social movement that's not been caught with its pants down. They're already mobilized and moving, and that's something to feel a little bit encouraged about.
Although the circumstances that gave rise to the tenants' rights movement it has been so dire that I mean, it seems to me that the response in terms of the tenants' rights movements that have been organized, as great as some of these organizations are, it's just so small compared to the problem. I mean, what we're looking at, like in many cities, it's like 1 out of 8 or 1 out of 9 households is evicted every year.
Yes. Yes. It's that bad. And the other problem, of course, is that the tenants' rights movement is widespread. But if you look at it in terms of the whole country, it's concentrated in certain cities and certain regions. This is a problem, evictions, that's going to sweep over the whole country. It's not going to leave any or very many locations that have very many people in them alone. And so the movement is challenged to grow at a time when its own members are facing pressures of their own. So that is a problem, sure.
Although maybe, I guess, if such a movement is going to grow, then if it's going to grow at any time, it would be when millions of people are facing eviction and have no alternatives but to actually organize a rent strike and take mutual aid, right? I mean, yeah. It worked in the 1930s in some places. I believe in Chicago they suspended forced evictions at some point in the 1930s. I don't remember what year they stopped it.
They did, and in other cities as well. And in fact, in 2008, when the crisis happened there were law enforcement, at least for a period, put a sort of an informal moratorium on evictions because they just couldn't see the point of, or they couldn't really see the advantage to maintaining order of putting a whole lot of families out on the street. It just didn't make sense to them. So it does happen. It does happen.
And then from a health perspective, it's fascinating to see the situation, even in the, I mean, it always, one of the things that drives me nuts the most is when they talk about governments such as the Democrat-dominated government of California or Oregon or Washington as being progressive, because these, I mean, whatever they mean by progressive, it obviously has nothing to do with the welfare of the average human being, because the people are suffering in these states. The inequality is just staggering. The tent cities that are now all over the country, but they're just amazingly, they're everywhere here. It's if the photos are black and white, and if the tents weren't made of plastic, it would look like the 1930s. And that's the only thing that saves us from looking like the 1930s is we've got too much plastic to sort of look like that anymore. And people don't wear hats anymore. All the unemployed people in the 30s had hats on. But
or caps.
Yeah.
They all were, well, in our popular memory, they all look like something like Henry Fonda and the Grapes of Wrath, whatever. But it was all canvas then, and it's all plastic. The interesting thing to me is that at that time, you had the movements that were helping people who were homeless or were in danger of it were much more overtly political. You had the Communist Party involved in a lot of cities, Chicago, Cleveland, etc. You had labor unions. You had the CIO very involved in some places. There was a kind of an organic link between the labor movement, leftist politics, and grassroots need. That there was a kind of a feeling that there should be a coalition there. This time, it's more fragmented. You have a very, very strong and very promising tenants' rights movement, but you don't have a sort of a very overtly political component to that, or a labor component to that. Not so much, and that's a problem. I mean, the decline of labor unions is still a very powerful sort of retarding effect on social movements in this country.
And that's something we're sort of confronted with in so many ways. It's like the legacy of what's this. We're not we didn't just face this crisis coming out of a vacuum. We come out of a situation where the labor movement has been basically eviscerated since the late 1940s, and
Right.
the sort of process has continued since then. And we're in a situation now where Trump is sending federal troops into this city in Portland and other cities like Chicago. And yet the reason why he's able to do these things, as far as I understand from a legal basis, it goes right back to Bush and Obama, and both of them supported increasing executive power and the NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act, which the vast majority of both parties voted for in Congress, and it gives the executive branch far more power. And now here we are.
Yeah, I'd like to link that up to something you were talking about just a minute ago, because I think there's a kind of an offensive here. There's almost a sort of a culture war going on here. We've got federal troops, or essentially militarized federal security agents, going into cities like Portland, and Trump is promising to take them into Chicago and other places as well. At the same time, and this is not to excuse the governors of California, Oregon, and Washington for their missteps, but at the same time, you have Congress or the Senate, the Trump administration, essentially refusing to help the states and cities that have been hard hit by this crisis. Their tax receipts have cratered. They're stuck. They can't borrow money beyond a certain point. They have to balance their budgets legally. They need help from the federal government to address this issue, to address the pandemic, and to address the economic crisis, and they're not getting it. So there's essentially a kind of a war going on between a Republican-dominated, at least in practical reality, federal government against states that are that it perceives to be its political enemy. And they're doing it by sending in federal troops. Every time he gets a chance, Trump talks about how these cities are run by liberal or radical Democrats, and you deny them money. So you create a kind of an atmosphere of failure around them, or you undermine their ability to address the crisis.
This is something that I don't know how many people are aware that, which seems worth making sure people know. States other than Puerto Rico, right, which is in a different situation and a terrible, terrible situation, but states are not allowed to borrow money. They're not allowed to go into debt. You said up to a certain point. I guess they have some limited capacity to borrow, but basically they cannot borrow themselves out of a problem the way the federal government can do,
because they can't issue their own currency. They have no flexibility, and then they're required by law to balance their budgets every year. So every year that when a problem like this comes up, where their budgets, where the tax revenues crater, they're in a crisis. And
then we're also in a situation where, as far as like in 48 out of 50 states, I think between, when it started, but I know the 80s was a big time for this going on, when housing was relatively cheap. And for the 48 out of 50 states have at this point now banned rent control on a statewide basis. And these are mostly states run by Democrats, and it was Democrats who banned rent control.
Absolutely.
And now we don't even have that as an option, right? So that when the governments here, state governments, city governments, all talking about what are we going to do about all these evictions? How are we going to? They don't have the money to give to the landlords if they wanted to just pay the landlords to not evict the tenants. They don't have that kind of money. The federal government maybe does, right? But then I don't know what would happen if they started just subsidizing all of these outrageously high market rate, so-called rents, so-called market rate rents. But I mean, it just seems like an immense sort of, I guess the technical term might be clusterfuck that we've now arrived at with this. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. It's not a question, but where is this possibly going to go? What if Democratic state administrations that were actually progressive wanted to do something about the situation? It seems like clearly first thing they would do is reinstate rent control.
Yeah, and actually, the New York State did strengthen rent stabilization last year. That was a very significant thing. Let me give you the worst case scenario. I always like to start with that. The worst case scenario is that we have evictions, but not just that. We have smaller landlords, sort of quote unquote mom and pop landlords, going broke themselves and losing the buildings that they own to the bank. And
which happened in 2008, right? That was a large scale phenomenon.
It did. And what happens to those properties is they get taken over by large private equity funds like Blackstone, which at that point started investing heavily in undervalued real estate, picking up properties for a song, and essentially creating a kind of a mega rental, sort of mega rental organizations around the country that are beholden to basically no one. So you have this enormous concentration of property going on at the same time. That does not bode well for renters. It doesn't bode well for homeowners either, because you have all sorts of properties that suddenly are taken off the market and turned into cash cows by big companies. So that's the worst case scenario. The best case scenario is something like what happened in the 1930s, which is you get the federal government stepping in with federal home loans that can help people to buy homes, stepping in to take over properties and manage them and turn them over to tenants. There were experiments like that happened in the 30s fairly successfully, and we could see something like that today. The question is whether these so-called progressive democratic governors, mayors, et cetera, have that kind of imagination or that kind of vision anymore.
Which it seems very evident. They keep on proving it over and over again. They do not have this kind of vision, and they only talk about the problem, in which they talk about all the time, and they declare it a crisis. Even here, they declared it in Oregon. They declared it the housing crisis a crisis, which then I guess freed up another couple of $1 million to create some COVID-19 hotspot housing shelters. Which before COVID, but I mean these housing. People in these shelters is a total health crisis, which it was long before COVID. I mean, there was something called tuberculosis, which is still very much a problem in all of the homeless community centers and places where people are housed in curfew situations, sort of prison-like settings, and in one case in a former prison here in Portland.
How appropriate.
Yeah, it's very appropriate.
Well, but
meanwhile, there's all these vacant hotel rooms, and
yeah, I mean, you touched on something that's very important here, which is that this economic crisis is bleeding over into a crisis that was already happening before any of this began, which is a public health crisis. We have a public health structure in this country that's been hollowed out for decades now, with cuts in funding, with elimination of stockpiles, and of any attempt to sort of get ahead of this sort of thing. And that's the other big difference. You were asking earlier about the difference between this country and, let's say, Europe. That's another major difference, is those countries have not hollowed out their public health sectors. Now, they've had problems too. In France, there's a danger of the hospital system being overwhelmed, but they were starting from a better place. Here, we were in danger of being overwhelmed right from the start. And there seems to be no incentive or no discussion at all about how to refund and reform public health in this country. And this is where I think that the situation we're in is not just a temporary crisis. This is a major failure of the state. This is a major failure of the system we live under to perform its obligations, to operate efficiently, and to serve the people in any way. You see a kind of a turning around and essentially turning their backs on what's happening to people, and treating health as something that's something you have to take care of for yourself. It's not something that the public or the community does. And for the state to do that, which essentially is in charge, it's a major failure. It's a major failure of the system we live under. And I don't think anyone's coming to grips with that yet.
And this, I mean, it seems like that to me, like being that I spend much of my time when I'm touring in Europe, where things are very different from here in so many ways, increasingly, it seems like it just is such a obvious failure of the more capitalist oriented states, where there aren't basic rights of things like healthcare and housing, which actually, to one degree or another, do exist in European societies and other societies. And we're seeing now that the right to healthcare in a European country means there's a massive national mobilization and all kinds of subsidies and all kinds of people doing all sorts of work to deal with the situation, whereas that's not the case here. But you also, when you talk about the state, I think people have all kinds of ideas about what that means, and this is sort of an area of that you've done a lot of writing on, and I wonder if you could just flesh that out a bit. What are we talking about? What is the state?
Yeah, I think that there's a need to think more broadly about what the state is. When we talk about the state, we're not just talking about government. In my view, we're talking about something much bigger and much deeper. We're talking about political parties. We're talking about pressure groups. We're talking about capital, because capital really is something that is vital to the state, and the state is something that's vital to capital. They're not just partners. Capital is part of this larger structure. We're talking about everything from PTAs and nonprofit groups, community groups that have legal existence because of the state. We're talking about households, which are structured around the system the state has created. We're talking about even, let's say, to the point of right-wing militias, which are essentially there to defend the idea, not of whether they say they're anti-government or not. They're there to defend the idea of the state. We're talking about you could even extend it to drug cartels, which depend on infrastructure set up by the state, and which actually do favors for the state on certain occasions. The CIA or groups like that want to put on pressure on leftist groups in countries that they're involved in. So the state is a kind of a web. It's a network. It's a kind of a directed group of institutions that create a kind of a reality we all live under. If that sounds a little nebulous, think for a second about how often you come into contact with groups that have some kind of legal connection with the state, some kind of dependency on it, that do business with the state, right down to a landlord who's got a filing cabinet full of deeds and permits of one sort or another, and other legal documents stemming from its relationship with the state. This is something that has built up over the last 500 years that we've had a modern state. And again, it sort of defines a reality for us. I like to analogize the state to an operating system like Windows or iOS, which essentially creates a kind of a functional, social, cultural reality for us that we can operate within. And the state isn't just a government. It's not just something we interact with and elect people to. It has a kind of a trajectory and an objective of its own, which is mainly to extend its power, to reproduce itself, and to extend itself into new territories and burrow more deeply into the community, into our consciousness, into the way we think about ourselves as people. The most obvious thing being patriotism, or the kind of the fierce loyalty that people in this country often have, especially white people, to police and the military. This feeling that these things are indications that we belong, that we are being protected, that this system works for us. And the state is something we have to think about a lot more carefully in all of its components. But one thing that the coronavirus pandemic has definitely prompted or should prompt us to think about is the state as a purveyor of health, or as a purveyor of some kind of element of or degree of personal security. The state really does three things. It provides security. It provides some kind of path to economic opportunity through its rules and so forth. And it provides a kind of a sense of identity. And when the state can't do those three things, we've got problems. And the state will go to quite a few lengths to make sure that that people in what I would call the core identity group, which in this case, in the case of the United States, would be white people of Northern European descent, it'll go to quite a few lengths to reassure those people that it is there for them. And that's where you get the kind of pandering that Trump does, for example, to sort of the dog whistle words that he sends out in terms of catering to a sort of a xenophobic white audience. That's kind of the last line of defense always for the state. So I think there's a lot in there, but I'm trying to sort of emphasize how complex an entity or a phenomenon the state is, and how difficult it is to oppose any one part of it when you've got the whole rest of it, exercising pressure in other ways. So I don't know if that brings up more questions than it answers, but that's the short version.
Yeah, well, of course, it brings up more questions than it answers. We only have an hour here, so this is what books are so good for. You can actually explore something in fairly substantially in a book, but if you were to try to read it out loud, it would take a heck of a lot more than an hour. Yeah. But in the 80s, I remember a lot of the term the revolving door started becoming commonly used. I don't know how long, maybe it predates the 80s, but it seems like the revolving door between sort of the corporations, the military, and the government it's not so much a revolving door now as just one big sort of messy entity with no semblance of what we traditionally have called checks and balances, right? I mean, it's just it seems like the role of the government has often been to sort of ameliorate or it keeps the effects of corporate capitalism from being as severe as they would be without the governments there, in order to allow the corporations to continue to make lots of money and oppress everybody. But if with the corporations just there by themselves, we'd end up with a revolution, right? Because the state wouldn't be there to do anything to keep them from just making profit all about everything, right? I mean, is that kind of am I getting somewhere with this?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I would take it one step further, which is to say that if the state didn't exist, corporations would have to invent it, because it needs that framework that can sort of mediate between it and the rest of the population. And it needs the state to set rules and guardrails that allow it to get away with the things that it gets away with, and to rationalize those for us. It's the partnership between the two is very intimate, and that's where that gets back to what you said about the revolving door. The Treasury Secretary, for example, in this country is almost always a Wall Street executive or somebody very close to that. The Federal Reserve Chair is always a mainstream conventional economist who's risen through the politics of the banking system. There's the Secretary of Defense often comes from the military-industrial complex. Donald Rumsfeld, back in the George W. Bush days, was a former CEO of a defense contractor. So was Dick Cheney. There's the connections here. It's what you would call the fox guarding the hen house, but that's the whole point. Is that essentially the state hands these people the tools to regulate themselves. and to use the state for their own benefit. That's how it's set up to work. When it comes to democracy, which is the other part of that, is that we have a very, very managed democracy, and we always have. Most of the major elements of the sort of political and economic system in this country were set up in the first few decades of American independence. In other words, before universal suffrage, at least for white people, was granted. In other words, before they let everybody vote, quote unquote, everybody, they first made sure that these institutions were in place and that they couldn't be disturbed by this new electorate, or there was very little chance they could be disturbed by this new electorate. And of course, now we have two established political parties, which essentially are subsidized by the federal government, and which are run by people who are very much of a particular kind of point of view. So, you know, you can call it, I collect these terms, actually. You mentioned the revolving door. In the 60s, they talked about the system. In the 70s, people on the right talked about the permanent government. Nowadays, the right talks about the deep state. And if you take the ideological sort of trappings away from those a little bit, or put them aside for a second, they're all really talking about the same thing. It's this sense that there is a kind of a permanent class, permanent self-selecting class that essentially sets the rules of the road. And tells you how wide the so-called Overton window is that we can actually work within in terms of what kind of policies are acceptable to talk about, and that's all kind of done over to the side, or you know, outside of earshot. And so, you know, you can then slap a conspiracy theory on top of that, but you know, which is a good way to sort of stigmatize the kind of conversation we're having, but the fact is that there is a kind of a directed element to the system we live in.
It's and then at some point the sort of basic sort of dynamic there, where the state is facilitating the exploitation of a society by corporations, whilst sort of setting a certain standard where there's some kind of enforcement of things like workplace safety and environmental laws and other housing regulations and whatever, like you find in many European societies, these kinds of things. And then the state serves this function of maintaining a sort of a certain degree of equilibrium in society. Whereas here, it doesn't work that way. It seems like, at least increasingly over the past few decades, it's much more of a matter of a total cannibalization of the state by corporations, to the point where the regulations don't exist anymore, right? I mean, it's like, or they exist in name only. But I think I read somewhere that even as recently as under the Obama administration, the Occupational Health and Safety Administration has enough of a budget to inspect one workplace every 29 years. Like, right. I mean, if each workplace can expect that every 29 years they might get an inspection.
Right. These organizations, these agencies have been hollowed out. I mean, I wrote a book on the history of the Social Security debate in this country. And part of what I cover in that book, I would have liked to spend a lot more time on it, is the way the Social Security Administration has been effectively hollowed out and stripped over the last several decades, going back to the Reagan days. That was an agency which used to be the most admired agency in the federal government. In terms of its efficiency, the way it worked, the way it was able to work with a comparatively small budget and get some amazing things done. And it was essentially hollowed out. It was, you defund an organization like that long enough, one of the things that goes is this computer system. One of the problems that we've had with testing for COVID in the last couple of months is the fact that the CDC, Centers for Disease Control, which whose budget has been starved for many, many years now, has a computer system that's no longer adequate to collect the data and process it quickly. Well, is that their problem? Is that government inefficiency, or is the fact that this institution has essentially been systematically starved for funds to update itself and upgrade itself? that's is a kind of a conscious sabotage goes on here, which is another thing you don't see so much in countries like the countries of the EU.
I was thinking recently about your most recent piece in Fifth State around the Gray Panthers and how the Gray Panthers should be revived. And here in Oregon, and I know this is not exceptional to Oregon, but here in Oregon, the employment department is running on Cobalt and Fortran, which, if you're as old as I think you and I are, you know what that is. But but lots of young people, not only my daughter, my 14-year-old daughter, had never heard a busy signal before. And so now I call the employment department every day, multiple times a day, and it's always a busy signal. And now she knows what a busy signal is. But they are running on programming languages that they literally have to get people. I just want to get a busy signal here out of. They have to get people out of retirement who are in their 80s, who actually. Oh my God, it's ringing. Oh well, there goes that. I'll get cut off at the end of the message. Usually it goes on for two. I'll just stay on hold there. Maybe that's the second time I've ever actually got. But then you get cut off at the end of the message. So, but maybe they're improving. It's quite a degree of ineptitude, of institutionalized ineptitude that's been going on for a long time. But can we just talk briefly for a few minutes about defunding of the police? Tell me about your. I mean, this is a wonderfully radical proposal, which would seem to get at the heart of everything, and is really scaring a lot of people in power. Just the conversations happening.
Yeah, there's two elements to defunding the police that are really important. One is it's not just defunding the police; it's taking that money and putting it into programs that. And this is the second key element of it, that are community-based, is when we talk about quote unquote social workers or people like that, we're talking about people in those communities who are familiar with the neighborhoods, familiar with the problems, and know how to address them. Mental health problems, malnutrition problems, problems of joblessness, problems of public health, problems that have to do with caregiving for elderly people in those communities. And we have a caregiving crisis throughout the country, but certainly in inner city, low-income communities, we have it. So you have a myriad of problems that essentially the police have been delegated to take care of for years and years. And defunding the police is partly an acknowledgement of the fact that those problems have to be dealt with directly and effectively, instead of simply being literally stomped down, which is what the police tend to do. So that's the exciting part of it, to me, is the prospect of putting all those resources, and believe me, if you look at the numbers, is the police have been showered with resources in big cities. Doesn't matter Republican or Democratic administration. The police unions are powerful. Law and order continues to be a very strong vote getter, and the result is that that law enforcement gets more and more money. That is an imbalance that has to change, and defunding the police is an acknowledgement that investment is not working, and that the investment needs to be in the communities themselves, not in bringing more cops who are generally from outside of the community in to essentially crack down on them.
Eric Laursen, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and hope to talk to you again soon.
Yeah, I hope to hear you back on the concert trail again, the touring trail soon, David.
Yeah, someday. Hopefully that'll happen again, but it's definitely not going to be happening as long as the cafes can only have 25% capacity or whatever, because it was a disaster before. The music industry collapsed already long before this.
And you don't want to be playing to cardboard cutouts, right?
This is pretty much like playing on the screen. I do that a lot now, but you might as well do a concert on somebody's Facebook page if you're going to just play for cardboard cutouts. But yeah, nothing against cardboard. But Thank you.
Thanks again for having me.
Yeah, pleasure. Thanks for being on. See you soon.
All right.
And this has been another episode of Fifth Estate Live. Thanks for tuning in to this discussion with Eric Laursen. And you can hear other episodes on fifthestate.org, and you can hear the next one next Tuesday. All my broadcasts every weekday are at 10 a.m. Pacific, noon Central, 1 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. GMT on the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance, Cable Community Radio, and elsewhere. And you can subscribe to the physical magazine, Fifth Estate, at fifthestate.org. There's the summer edition. It's quarterly. The summer edition is coming out soon. And you can find all these interviews archived in various other places, including in the Discussions with David playlist at youtube.com/drovics. There's also a Fifth Estate Live playlist just for the Fifth Estate Live episodes. And you'll also find them archived in audio form on SoundCloud, on Patreon, and as well as if you subscribe to the podcast This Week with David Rovics on any podcasting platform. If you're somewhere in the region of Portland, Oregon, please go to artistsforrentcontrol.org and sign up for text notifications to be part of Portland Emergency Eviction Response to help us mobilize against the coming waves of evictions. I've got a crowdfunder for an album project going, also known as a musician and audio engineer employment scheme. You can check that out at davidrovics.com/pandemic sessions. Remember, don't pay the rent and don't be afraid of your neighbors. Mutual aid will get us through. See you soon. Bye for now.